and the Challenge of Equity. This effort was led by Cristina Pombo, Senior Advisor to the President, Benjamin Roseth, Senior Specialist of the Institutional Capacity of the State Division, Juliet Santamaria, Regional Economist of the Southern Cone Countries, Carolina Rivas, researcher, New York University, and Mateo Vasquez, Senior Operations Associate of the Office of the Special Advisor on Gender and Diversity. This book is a result of a collaborative effort between the Vice Presidency for Sectors and Knowledge through the Institutional Capacity of the State Division and the Social Sector, and the Vice Presidency for Countries and Regional Integration through the Southern Cone Department. To begin this event, we're glad to welcome Mariano Bosch, who is the Senior Economic Advisor to the Vice Presidency for Sectors and Knowledge, and Anavel Gonzalez, Vice President of Countries and Regional Integration. So I give the floor now to Mariano. Hello, everyone. How are you? Welcome to this event. It has been a pleasure to be here. I'm glad I was invited. It's a pleasure to be here for this event. Well, here we're looking at equity, digital transformation, which are two very pertinent issues for what this book does. The book entitled Disconnected Digital Public Services and the Challenge of Equity. Oh, it seems like I was disconnected here with my mic, but I wanted to congratulate the team, Juliet, Benjamin, Mateo, Carolina. I was actually present when this book was initially planned, and it's a true honor to be here to see this book launched a few years later. I know how hard it is to produce these analytical knowledge products. They're complex, they're wonderful, like this book, and I know this takes a lot of dedication. This book is testament of the perseverance of our staff. They have been moving from job to job within the bank in some cases, but nonetheless continuing with this very important effort. So I wanted to congratulate the authors. And those of us that are concerned with the high degree of inequality in the region, this is an important publication. Digitalization is promising. It is supposed to provide equal access to services and to opportunities for the population in the region. And artificial intelligence, digital technologies allow all people, regardless of where they were born, what their skills are, to access these possibilities. So here we can say we all have a telephone, and the telephone connects us to the world. The book gives us many examples of how our phones allow us to reach places which before we couldn't reach. For example, in the city of Buenos Aires, where a lot of people use their phone, the people living in Buenos Aires have access to something called BOTI. BOTI was launched by that city's government to provide access to public services without requiring a computer or without having to have extreme digital skills. And there are millions of contacts made in this way every year. And that was before ChatGPT was available. This was launched in 2019. And during the pandemic, it played a very important role. It issued, for example, vaccination certificates. And so this is a good example of how this connects us to an essential service. And there's also a lot of debate about the risk of these technologies, how that is going to affect vulnerabilities, how it's going to affect mental health. Those of us who have adolescent children, we think about this topic a lot, and this is very important. It's something that we're working on here in the bank. There is several research products currently being worked on. Here we're looking at access of digital services on the part of adolescents, but this book addresses this subject from a different angle. It talks about digital technologies and how they're going to provide us to access of many things, and that will be good, provided we don't leave anyone behind. That is what this book says. We don't want anyone to be disconnected. So let me give you some examples. For example, in Peru, the orphan bonus allowed us to increase coverage when it went from the analog to the digital version. And in that way, the number of beneficiaries went from 18,000 to 80,000. So this is for orphans in vulnerable families. So this does open up doors to the most vulnerable. In Colombia, another program on Ingreso Solidario between 2020 and 2022, it made deposits to vulnerable families digitally during the pandemic, saving the cost that would correspond if they did that in an analog fashion. So this book allows us to dream of how we can go through all of these digital transformations and allow our citizens to have access to services, to opportunities in a context when there are fiscal constraints and where we have to think about cost-effective solutions, more affordable solutions, but of course we run into major challenges, and this is precisely the challenges addressed in the book. Now, the digital gap that we're trying to narrow have a lot to do with already existing gaps: access to the internet, access to devices, access to digital skills. And this is precisely the challenge laid out by the book. How can you guarantee equitable access to digital service when we have millions of people who are not connected? Without an inclusive design right from the start, the digital channel can worsen the gaps instead of narrowing them. And in a highly unequal region, in so many different dimensions, a digital transformation could worsen that gap. So this book tries to address that concern that we all share. Now, it provides us with very innovative data. It talks about the digital transformation so far and how equitable it has been, how we can make sure this transformation will leave no one behind. And just like Boti, the orphan bonus, the services in Colombia, all of these examples teach us that this technology can have a positive impact, but we are facing a historical quandary. We can provide digitalization for everyone, or are we doing this just for a few? Or should we redouble our efforts to design public services that will include everyone? So this book not only alerts us to possible risks, but it also lays out a path forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
Thank you,
Mariano.
Mariano. Now give the floor to Anavel Gonzalez from Countries, the Vice Presidency for Countries and Regional Integration.
Good afternoon to all those that are here in person and those that are connected virtually. It's really a pleasure to be part of the launch of this book that talks about such a relevant issue for the region: how to manage, or what to do to make sure that the digital transformation is accessible to all and that allows us to be a more equitable region. As Mariana was saying, digitalization has a great potential in order to bring the state closer to people. From our country offices, we see how governments are moving forward with intention, with rigor in this agenda, simplifying procedures, medical reports, education systems, among many other efforts. All these steps are very concrete towards more efficient, transparent governments and also closer to their citizens. We also know that in terms of improving government services, technology is truly important. However, in and of itself is not sufficient if it doesn't reach everyone. It can increase inequality. And that's why from the IDB we work to make sure that digitalization is also an inclusion tool. This book is being published at a very in a timely moment. It shows scientific information about who's being left behind, and it provides recommendations to design digital public policies. And it does all this through collaboration among vice presidency. The alliance between VPS and VPC made it possible, made this book possible. In terms of sectoral knowledge and the knowledge from country offices, this knowledge product is the result of analysis and actions that complement each other in order to create real impact on the region. Thanks to this collaboration, we're launching a book today, but we are also creating new databases that will allow researchers as well as policymakers to make decisions that are evidence-based. In addition, in the coming weeks, reports will be published by country with specific findings. All this in order to make sure that knowledge supports the daily work of specialists in our offices and our counterparts in the governments. I would also like to highlight something very important about this book. This launching is an effort that is also precedent in terms of innovation and accessibility within the IDB. Equity requires of a tool that is thought through for different people and is accessible. That's why the book was designed with colors for colorblind people, with spaces so that it's easy to read, graphics and tables that will allow them to be interpreted by text readers, among other things. And there's also an audiobook accessible through different channels for those that have visual difficulties. All these are details that make a difference and reflect the spirit of the book, that the digital and the public space are accessible to all. I would like to close by congratulating especially Christina, Benjamin, Juliet, Carolina, and Mateo, the teams from ICS, SCL, and CSC, and all those that made this collective effort possible. This book provides knowledge, and it also shows that when we work in a coordinated, innovative, and inclusive manner, we can build a good that combines action and evidence in order to generate real impact on the lives of people, which is, of course, what matters the most. Thank you very much and congratulations. Thank you, Anavel and Mariano, for your words. Next, we will move on to the presentation of the book by Juliet Santamaria and Carolina Rivas, co-authors of this publication, who will present the main findings of the book. Juliet, Carolina, the floor is yours. Good afternoon. Thank you, Anavel, and Mariano, for your welcoming remarks. Everyone in this room and everyone connected has done some sort of procedure, administrative procedure, bureaucratic procedure at some point in their lives. And we know how difficult it is when you have to do that in person. You have to go to physically to a government office, you have to use transportation, you have to wait in line. Digitalization changed all that radically, because now we can do all these procedures 24/7 from the comfort of our homes, and that really saves a lot of money. An example of these savings has to do with the time actually that it takes you to do a specific procedure. If you do it in person, more or less, it takes 6 hours on average in the region. But if the person decides to do so digitally, it only takes 40 minutes. And this difference makes a huge difference for citizens. if everything is so positive, everyone should be doing it this way. Let's think we have 10 people representing the region. Out of those 10 people, 7 did some sort of procedure with the government over the last 12 months. 3 of them didn't. Now, if we focus on the 7 people that actually did some sort of procedure with the government, 5 of them decided to do so in person, and only 1 person did it digitally. Another additional person would have decided to combine both channels. Now, the use of the digital public service channels is quite low. Who is benefiting from this digitalization? This is the question that inspired us in order to write this book. And in order to do so, we collected new data that we made available to you all currently, the different type of data. First, new surveys in 11 countries in the region. It has representative samples and also user samples. We carried out interviews with digital government divisions, and we also analyze accessibility and language, the use of languages, or in how many languages government websites were available. So this is what there was a whole team collaborating, and we answered the following questions. Who are really taking advantage of the benefits of digitalization? And we see a clear pattern. First of all, those that have a higher level of education. As you can see on the graph on the screen, 29% of the people with third level or university studies decided to do their whatever proceeding they needed to do digitally. Only 7% with less than primary education decided to do it digitally. That shows a gap of 22 percentage points in the use of this type of tool. In addition, we found that the youngest people are the ones that use this digital channel the most. 18% of those between 18 and 34 years old used this digital channel, compared to 7% of the people that are 55 or older. And the patterns repeat themselves among most of the demographic groups. We can see that among people with disabilities or without disabilities. For example, without disabilities, we see 9 percentage points higher than when it's people with disabilities. The same thing, urban versus rural, or those that don't identify themselves as Afro-descendants or indigenous. There's also a gap there. The good news here is that we find small gaps in the use of digital channels between men and women. That gap between men and women is very small. Now, what we asked ourselves was, what is the reason for these gaps? And we decided to answer this question from 2 approaches, from the supply first and then from the demand. And Carolina will address the demand side in a few minutes. From the supply side, what we focused on was if the government was providing the services that citizens were seeking. So what were the most requested proceedings from citizens or procedures? We have 2 of them on top, identification and registry. And then those that have to do with vehicles that are used by most citizens. And then we have public health, public education, and public employment. We're going to call them social procedures. And then at the bottom of that list, we see 2 procedures that I'm going to use as examples: tax procedures and business procedures. Now, what the government is doing is digitalize what type of procedure specifically? Well, let's take 2 examples from 2 countries. social procedures in Mexico and Brazil, we found that 24% of the social procedures for Mexico and 93% for Brazil of these social procedures are digitalized. And in contrast, these figures are 65 for tax procedures for Mexico and 100% for Brazil. So the gap is clear in terms of the procedures that are being digitalized. And why does this happen? Well, there are different reasons, but two of them have to do with the following. Governments need a more strategic approach regarding the procedures that need to be digitalized first, and each institution decides when to digitalize their procedure instead of having a single one that establishes all the priorities among all the procedures offered by the government. Now, the region is really moving forward in terms of digitalization. So we wanted to see if the procedures were designed from the get-go in such a way so that everyone had access to them. And that is a question we posed ourselves. We analyzed 20 government websites. What did we find? Two things. The good news, 80% of the portals actually meet different criteria. Simple language. There are a lot of good things done in this regard. And the bad news is that many of the portals do not have basic characteristics in terms of accessibility, such as the labeling of the titles on the website and clear headings that will make reading the portal possible with automatic readers. Now we're going to move on to the demand side. Moving on. Why do we have these gaps? Juliet talked about the supply. I'm going to talk about the demand. By demand, what I mean is specifically four things that I'm going to explain now in detail. Have, can, know, and want. What are the components that citizens need in order to have access to public services? The first thing that we wondered was, do they have the tools to have access? Do they have internet, a mobile device? Do they have a computer? What we found out was that 1 out of 3 people in the region have a computer at home. But like Juliet showed, there are gaps, and the gaps are based on the educational level, the age of the person, if the person lives in a rural area or an urban area. The second component, to be able to do basic digital tasks. How many people have digital skills in order to do this type of activity? By basic digital skills, I mean scanning a document, attach a file to an email, and so on and so forth. And we see a correlation between the user channels and the number of skills that people report to have. As you can see on the bottom bar, 25% of the people using the in-person channel reports to have 0 digital skills. In contrast with those that use the digital channel, we see 28% of them reporting to have 7 out of the basic skills that we asked about in the survey. So clearly, there is a correlation between the confidence they have in their digital skills and the channel that they're using. 3, to know. Do we know if this type of digital procedure exists in the region? What we found out was that 43% of people in the region know that there is a single portal in their country. A single portal, a single window, is a website that has a host of digital public services that address different issues and that involve different institutions. So as we saw in previous graphs, there are gaps. Those that have greater knowledge or skills are those that are the youngest, they're most educated, those that are out of any type of vulnerable situation. And finally, to want. What do people want in terms of using online tools? We saw that 44% of people prefer digital tools and 55% prefer to use analog tools and they prefer to do it in person. Then there's a great variety in the region. We have countries such as Uruguay, where almost 60% of the population prefer digital channels, versus Honduras, for example, with 32%. The the good news is that those that have used digital channels are willing to use them again. This shows that really they had a good experience when using a digital channel.
Now, let's zoom in on social services. And also, I wanted to thank the members that helped us draft this chapter. They're here. Don Gabriel Dando, Cecilio Ambrundo, Leonardo Kini, Leonardo Cerete, and Santiago Perez. Now, why is it important to zoom in on these social services? For two reasons. One, because this has an impact on day-to-day living, and because they're the most used. 40% of all the procedures in recent years were social services. That means uh, putting your child in school, looking for a job through the public portal, to set up an appointment with the doctor, to request a non-contributory pension, and also to report theft, for example. So what do we see? Public social services show some heterogeneity in terms of the public job service. There's a preference in terms of using digital channels. 46% of the people requesting employment use that channel, compared with the other extreme, which is health. Only 12% of the population used a digital channel for health purposes. Then something else we wanted to focus on is citizen security. In citizen security, we find a good example because there are gaps. Here you can see the percentage of people that are acquainted with at least one digital channel to report a crime. Those that are most educated, the youngest population, those in an urban area. We didn't see a major difference in terms of gender, though. Now, in terms of digital registration, what we see is digitalization reduces the time. Juliet said that. So it can take you 4 hours to do something in person, but 16 minutes if you do it digitally. And so families that often have social demographic restriction can use this, but there are other types of barriers too. And that is why it's important to look at the complexity of the issue. The people using a digital channel also reported that they have more problems, and that is the number of positions available. They say it's hard to get information, that the processes are complex. So this is looking at the type of barriers that exist so we can see how we can get rid of those barriers. Now we conclude with this slide, but there is a takeaway that is important. And here we go. This is the takeaway. First of all, it isn't enough to just digitalize government procedures. So what is the challenge? The challenge is making sure that everyone truly has access to public services. And when I say everyone, we're especially thinking of the most vulnerable, those who are less educated, and also the elderly. Only in that way will digitalization become a tool that is equitable and will not be an additional barrier. Thank you, Juliet. Thank you, Carolina, for that presentation. Now, to explore these findings, let's have a conversation. This will be moderated by Nadia Rocha, who is the Senior Economic Advisor to the Vice Presidency for Countries and Regional Integration, with the participation of Benjamin Rosseth and Christina Pombo, co-authors of the book. So while we're waiting for them to take their places, we invite those of you who are here in person to prepare your questions for the authors of the book. And those of you who are following us online, please send us your question through the chats that have been enabled on the different platforms. Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, congratulations. I wanted to congratulate the authors and those who contributed to the book. I was able to get an advance copy of the executive summary so that I would know more about the book, but the results are quite revealing. And here I am repeating something that was said by Mariano and by Anavel, and that is in the countries we always are thinking of digitalization as a tool that makes things more democratic, that it provides access to more people. But the results we just I'm sorry, the results we just saw say that that may not always be the case. So here we wanted to explore these matters in greater detail, looking at these two elements, the two elements that would seem to be in opposition. So first, I wanted to ask, what were the patterns? What patterns did you study? What patterns did you see in the region before you wrote this book? And what led you to write this type of publication? Well, thank you. I would say that we were motivated by two things. Some things that were rather obvious, but also a feeling of responsibility. The obvious things are that digitalization of public services has uh, become more and more frequent, in part because of the pandemic, but that has been gaining speed. And then what concerned us was we know that there are gaps in connectivity and there are other differences that exist in the region. So, seen uh, from 10,000 feet, we know that these two patterns really don't go together well. So what happens if there are structural gaps that stand in the way of some people, a lot of people, being able to fully benefit from digitalization? And then also we had a feeling of responsibility. We, right from the beginning, have been promoters and financiers of digitalization. We believe in it, but we also are constantly concerned with equity. Mariano said that at the outset. So we said, okay, we have to make these two agendas compatible. Digitalization cannot worsen the tremendous inequity that we have in the region. So to make these two agendas compatible, we had to go to the essence of the situation. Who is using these services? Why are they being used? Why are they not being used? What strategies can we put in place to make certain that digitalization will be an engine of equity? Thank you, Ben. Christina, a question for you. Christina, what are the three main recommendations that you found in your report? The recommendations to make public services more inclusive. I think that Carolina and Juliet touched on that during their presentation, but when we were writing the book, when we were putting together the chapters, and as Mariano said, this does take time. So of course we had a lot of discussions within the team. And also I changed jobs in the middle of the process, so we had to space out the meetings. But I think that in our discussions, we saw something becoming clearer and clearer. Those recommendations that were going to be cost effective, the quicker recommendations, the most inexpensive steps, what could be done so as to help people quickly. So we had to act quickly, but we didn't want to leave anyone behind. And I think that almost everyone has at home a parent who says, I can't do this. Or if in the middle of a procedure they say, okay, you'll get the PIN in 30 seconds, but the PIN code does not arrive and the computer is about to time out. So we had to come up with something that wouldn't leave anyone behind. And when we say we have to be inclusive, we were thinking about the poor, we were thinking about people of cultures different from ours, or educated people but that are older, they too are being left out, or people that are in a place that don't have a good Wi-Fi connection. So those people are being left out too. So it is actually a very small group that can engage in these digital transactions. So our recommendation was to digitalize more, but do so thinking of everyone. And then the next question was, okay, if we're going to digitalize and include everyone, include these people in designing these applications, because a lot of people say, okay, the way I used to do it on paper, I'll do it exactly the same on my computer. And the logic behind using a device is different from doing this on a piece of paper. And if I do it on the computer, it's different than if you're doing it on the phone. So sometimes you think, okay, that worked great on my computer, but it's not working on my phone because the page looks different or because no one designed this thinking of everyone else. It really shouldn't be a barrier to say to people, include more people. It is important that they think of all sorts of people when they design these digital solutions. So this was a recommendation. Then a second thing was, let's not forget dealing with people in person. There are a lot of people that would actually prefer to go to the office in person. I was reading an article of some older people in Spain, and they said, for me, going to the bank was great because I would get out of the house, I would run into friends, and now I can't do that because they want me to do everything in a digital format. So it's important that we also remember that we have to upgrade the in-person service at the same time that we're digitalizing others. It's good that you work with your parents, because sometimes I feel like I'm in that group of the elderly when I'm trying to do some of these things online. But it was great about what was said about digitalization allowing you to make things more efficient, but that doing things in person also has its charm. Now, in the presentation, we heard of average values across the region, but also we saw that there were charts that showed a lot of heterogeneity on both the supply and demand side of these services. So what are the differences that you would like to highlight, the most important ones maybe? There's Chile, there's Uruguay, there's Honduras, and there's everyone else. Chile is the second country. 41% of persons do their procedures online. So they're the second most common users. Now, in terms of educational level, there is a gap of 40 percentage points between the highest and the lowest level of learning. Also, there are the biggest gaps by gender and by age. Then Uruguay. Some of you have worked in Uruguay, you may have studied there, and you know that they talk about digital transformation with equity. That is their slogan. And you see that not only are they the country with the highest level of use of digital channels, with 51% of the people using digital devices to do their procedures online, but also it's a very uh, equalitarian country in terms of age and gender. Then Chile, Uruguay, and we can say that they are the best providers of services in general. Not only do they have the usage percentages that are at the top of the chart, but also their digital procedures are the fastest. So that reflects investment, concern with the quality of the service, and not only that, but the in-person procedures also are the quickest. That means that there is a more comprehensive approach behind the rendering of these services. Chile, Uruguay, followed by Honduras, which is at the other end of the spectrum. Honduras has a digital adaptation rate that is low. 7% of the people have done some procedure online. And it's also the country with the most delayed percent in person or digital procedures, and the gaps are large.
And then we have all the other countries that we studied, the other 8. And all these countries have rates between 15 and 25% of digital use for the people that did their procedures at least partially online. And there are notable gaps in terms of adopting the digital channel based on the different segments that we analyze: education level, urban versus rural, gender, among other items. Now we can move on to how we're going to implement the findings of this book. What type of implications do you think the findings have in terms of operation of the work that is done by the IDB? Well, in terms of operations, there's a very important lesson here. I lost count, but from what I remember, and correct me if I'm wrong, at least in the social sector, more than 80% of the operations already had a digital component. So there, they were already thinking about something digital in their operations. And I think it's the same for the rest of the bank. I think one of the most important things is that it's not sustainable to have a digital component if it's not developed in an inclusive manner. And that's clear, crystal clear. Every time we design a project, we need to ask ourselves the basic questions. Target population, what is the solution that we need? Digitalization is not always the solution. I think the book shows that this is a key question. What is the problem that you need to solve? What is the target audience? Do we have the necessary conditions in place in order to have access to such services? If I learned something from Miguel Porruo, is check the conditions of the digital, of the e-government in order, because developing a solution in a vacuum won't work, basically. And is it necessary to include things in the project to put down those barriers when we start talking about digitalization with equity? Can the project establish conditions in order to eliminate such barriers? If we're going to work with the government in order to develop a digital platform, maybe we could ask the government to make the platform inclusive. The answer is a clear yes. And that way we could also have different options. If we could have a chatbot, which is very simple, or to redesign completely how a service is delivered. That's another solution. Or something that has to do with less data, or to have externalities in terms of interoperability, cybersecurity. All those are the issues that we need to take into account. What are the enabling factors that are going to make such digital solution inclusive and sustainable? A second operational issue that we learned based on the findings of the book, and here I'm a little bit biased, we need to measure everything, and all the data has to be included in a database, because everything that we collect will be important for future work. I was talking to Pablo yesterday, and we were talking about this. We carried out 11 surveys in this book, and all the data is truly enriching, that will help the DFDA that is being done in terms of digitalization, and it will help with other operations so that they can justify a lot of their interventions. We need to measure and we need to share the data. Key operational lessons that we gathered from this book, basically. Thank you, Chris. Now, moving on to the last question, Ben. What do you think are the most convincing arguments for government leaders so that they can include the issue of digital equity in their agendas? 3. First, adverse effects of inequality, effectiveness of public policy, and fiscal returns. So in terms of adverse effects of inequality, we know that inequality leads to a series of evils. For example, democratic participation, in terms of democratic participation or tax collection. We do not need another exacerbating issue in terms of inequality in the region. Then public policy effectiveness. Increasingly, as Chris said, and as it is clear when we check our operations, there are digital parts when it comes to delivering public services. Almost all those that touch a citizen have the option of taking a step digitally. At the pace that we're moving, it's just a matter of time until this is the norm, until some governments say, the in-person option is not needed anymore. I'm not going to invest any, or I'm going to invest more in the digital option. So if I, as a government, want to make sure that my public policy reaches the target population, it means that we have to meet different criteria that we mentioned in the book. Otherwise, public policies are going to be designed over here, the delivery of the services are going to be over there, and we are going to have big gaps. We're going to have public policies that fall through the gaps in such chain. And finally, tax returns. We know that it is much cheaper to provide a digital service than an in-person service. However, in order for that to be clear in a public budget, you need a massive transformation between the in-person modality and the digital modality. And that massive transition is a mass adoption. How do we achieve this mass adoption? Well, just offering services to those highly educated that live in cities, uh, and that are from ethnic majorities. Do we achieve that way? No. If we take into account just one variable, we know that most of the population has primary education or less. So let's think about education. Are we going to achieve a mass adoption of digital services if we only help those with high levels of education? No. And if we only help those with high levels of education, they are going to get, are we going to receive or increase our tax collection? No. So it's also a very clear issue. We need high levels of adoption, and in order to have such high levels, we need the services to be inclusive so that we can increase our tax collection. So thank you very much, Ben. Truly interesting conversation. I would like to use the last minutes of our time to open the floor to those here in person. If anyone has a question or those online, please introduce yourselves before you ask a question. Thank you very much, Mauricio Rodriguez. I work for ICS. Congratulations for this publication in terms of operations. I think this publication contributes a great deal of data, truly valuable for what we do. At the end of the day, it will allow us to shed light over a problem. My question has to do with the use of technologies, leaving behind these gaps or barriers, or trying to bridge these gaps between those that have access to digital services and those that don't. When we talk about artificial intelligence, a lot is said in terms of it that is has a potential to increase these gaps. So in terms of service provision, it also has the capacity to bring access to populational groups that would not have access to such services through the digital channels that are currently being used. So I wanted to ask if in this publication you also analyzed this, an overview of how this type of technology of artificial intelligence could actually help bridge the gap between among those who are disconnected. I think I would like to disentangle a little bit what you have said. In the book, we are focusing on digitalization, not so much on the different technologies, but we thought we really gave it a thought to the technologies behind. the thing is, there's not a single technology can do it all. You have to be very aware of what artificial intelligence can do and cannot do. And then we have to think about the factors that will allow people to use artificial intelligence. You need enormous amount of data that is clean and ready to be used. Then you need also certain interoperable conditions that will allow you to interconnect so you can use more and more data. And in addition, and this is part of what the book shows us a lesson learned, you need training so that people can actually use it. And passive training, it's not only sessions, training sessions, but also passive training where the civil servant can teach the user how to use artificial intelligence or this tool. We realized that, again, artificial intelligence must be person-centered so that so that its full potential can be tapped into. What do I mean by this? So that the decision is made by someone and not by artificial intelligence based on a recommendation of a model that you developed. The person has to be placed in the center when you're using the data. When artificial intelligence is using data, the entire population has to be represented. That has to do with equity, inclusion. That's what we are talking about. So artificial intelligence, or basically our recommendations apply to all different types of technology. When we talk about integration, we talk about any type of technology. Today is artificial intelligence. Tomorrow it can be anything else, but the principles that apply are all the same, must be the same. Thank you, Chris. There was another question here in the audience. Thank you. Truly interesting. One of the conclusions highlighted by Chris had to do with the need of a regulator within the government, a coordinator that will prioritize the needs and the demands by the population, and that will bring some order to the digitalization process that has taken place maybe in a disorderly way. What entity allows to coordinate the priorities of the different ministries, entities, departments to reach such a macro decision? And what does that entail for organizations such as ours? Because sometimes we replicate those problems. How can we do this work with a greater sense of equity as an organization? I'm looking at Miguel here, who has been a big champion of a concept that will answer this question, which is a digital government interrepresentative. So all governments are promoting the digital agenda, and this exists with greater or lesser institutional strength. What we don't have is institutions are empowered to be the champions of digital equity, with some exceptions. Uruguay and Peru are cases where equity is placed in the center of their agenda. These entities could actually lead the digital agenda in different ways. From a strategic standpoint, in the book, we carried out an analysis of the strategies of e-government to see what inclusion elements were included. And the reality is that we have a very diverse panorama. Some of the countries consider one or two elements, for example, young people, people with disabilities, and so on and so forth, but no one takes into account all the different groups. Another thing at a different level, maybe one that has more to do with coordination, we see that these digital coordinators, so to speak, have the word digital in their name, but not much more. Like Juliet and Carolina said, the digitalization of services many times responds to vertical logics. Why? Because the tax authority, for example, wants to digitalize A. They do that without talking to anyone else. They have the power to do so, and that's great. And the same happens in the Ministry of Agriculture. Nothing is digitalized because it's not in their mind. Therefore, in order to have strategic priorities in place that connect those in need with the digitalization process, there's a single entity in the government that can have this responsibility. And it is the digital coordinating entity. And then at an operational level, there are many things that are being done by the different governments, but not with an equitable approach. Basic things that are part of a digital agenda, but that can be addressed an from the standpoint of equity. For example, interoperability. Interoperability is a basic characteristic of a digital government agenda to prevent people from having to provide data that the government already has. How does that help equity? Well, it has to do with the design of the service. It makes a huge difference if you compare a service that is requesting 8 pieces of data come from different forms, and a service that just asks for 1 piece of data, and the other 7 are collected from different sources. So those that have fewer digital skills, less educational level, less physical capacity, can have access to such service. Another example, the single domain. Caroline and Juliet mentioned that we asked about awareness or knowledge of a single portal and its accessibility. This single portal has everything to be the best website of the government, but many times it's not. So what can we do through this single portal in order to facilitate access to services? We can include criteria that has to do with simple language, multiple languages, standards that have to do with visual accessibility, or you could add also characteristics that make it easy to navigate, just to make sure that more people access the digital channels.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of this conversation, but I know that there were a lot of raised hands, and I'm sure that we have other questions online. So those of you here in the room, I hope you will stay after the event to talk to the authors. They're not leaving soon. So I'm not going to try to sum up what has been said here, but the next step is very important. It's important that we get this book out, that it be made available in the countries, so as to support the dialogue that could lead to reforms that will support operations. But I would call for a round of applause for our panelists. Thank you very much, Nadia Ben, and I thank all of those who participated. I now call on Paula Acosta for some closing remarks. I know that we have gone over a little bit, but I think that the message that we are getting from this book is truly disruptive. When you try to answer the question of how can we make access to a service universal, the usual answer is, well, digitalize it. And you think that by so doing, you magically open it up to everyone. And what you do with this book is tear down that paradigm and make us all think of, although digitalization may be a great tool and it has tremendous potential of creating access, equity, economies of scale, increasing the participation of many citizens that in the past have not had access, it has to be done in a very deliberate, well thought out way. And I think that the 22,000 surveys that you did and you collected are a point of departure for a research agenda. Fabricio was asking about how with new technologies What is going to happen with the gap, the digital gap? Will it become broader? Will it narrow? And all of that has to do with progress in time. In the past, we were looking at digital transformation agendas of 21 countries, and Brazil has 171 million single users of their digital platform. So that digital platform is important to generate access because as citizens, we need to have a digital identity so as to gain access to these services. So this is an agenda that begins with, and we heard from Christina about the different social services, but they have a digital component too. And in the institutional capacity of the state division, we in 85% of our projects have included some digital identity, and that's probably applicable across the bank. So this publication makes it necessary for us to all rethink and to be very explicit, very intentional in terms how we can generate equity through the different digitalization progresses. They go from the single portal that has been supported by the bank through the digitalization of tax procedures. That too has been very important, but also this has to be part of the integration agenda that we have for the region, because that too will have implications. In almost all of the agendas that we have, this is definitely part of the effort. So this is something that affects the entire bank. And because of the potential this has, we need to devote a lot of effort, a lot of study to making optimum use of the potential of the digitalization tools. So with that, I call for a round of applause for our speakers, and that brings us to the end of this event. Thank you. Thank you for being with us. Thank you also, Paula, for your closing remarks. Those of you who are still with us here in person, please do join us for a coffee break. Thank you, and we hope to be in touch soon.